Okay, so I think we both agree that as philosophers, we basically just spend all of our time thinking about, the big questions.
Yeah, the nature of reality.
Right, exactly. Like, what is knowledge?
How do we know things?
Exactly, yes. And so I think today's deep dive is really going to kind of hit at the core of all of that because we're going to be looking at this idea that some of what we take to be these, like, objective truths are actually socially constructed.
It's a very interesting, sometimes unsettling idea, especially for those of us who are drawn to the sort of standard picture of the world that science gives us, sort of the naturalistic picture.
Right.
And so our deep dive today is going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on naturalistic approaches to social construction to really unpack this idea. What is social construction? What does it mean for something to be socially constructed? How does that potentially clash with the sort of naturalistic picture of the world and of science? And what are the implications for, all the things that we care about as philosophers?
Right. I mean, the first thing, even just hearing you describe this, like, it just makes me think about, okay, so if it's not just kind of how we talk about things, if it's not just the representations, if it's like the actual facts themselves, or even us, right, our very natures,
Yeah.
what does that mean for us as philosophers?
Yeah, and so that's you know, the sort of central tension that the entry highlights right from the beginning is this tension between what's called naturalism, the idea that science is our kind of best guide to understanding the independent facts about the world,
Right.
and social construction, which says, maybe some of the things that we take to be objective facts, maybe even scientific facts, are actually under our control. They're a result of social and cultural factors.
So this entry breaks it down in terms of this relationship. It says X socially constructs Y, right?
Right.
And so I guess that's kind of the first thing that we need to unpack, right?
Exactly. What is the X and what is the Y?
Who or what does the constructing and what exactly is constructed?
Right. So that's, I think, a great way to approach this. So let's start with the first part of that. What does the constructing?
Right.
And the entry gives us kind of helpful way of dividing this up. It says there are sort of impersonal agents of construction and personal agents of construction.
Okay.
So, and I think that's a good starting point. So let's think about the impersonal ones first.
Right.
These are things like conventions, cultures, institutions, social structures, sort of the background conditions against which all of our experience takes place.
It's like the water that we're swimming in and don't even realize it's there.
Exactly, yeah. And the entry immediately brings in some, I think, very interesting philosophical ideas to illustrate this. For example, Kuhn's work on the theory-latedness of observation. The idea that what we perceive is not just a kind of, direct reception of sensory information.
Right.
It's also shaped by our background beliefs, our theories about the world, the concepts that we bring to bear on experience.
Like our culture has already kind of pre-filtered our reality.
Exactly. And the entry points to some really interesting psychological work that kind of provides the foundation for this, the so-called New Look psychology.
Okay.
Research done in the mid-20th century that showed that expectations actually can alter people's perception. What you expect to see actually influences what you see.
Wow.
And a very interesting concrete example of this comes from Lacour's work, where he shows how pre-existing notions of sexual difference actually influenced anatomical observations.
Oh, interesting. So it's not even like hard science is immune from this.
Right, exactly. That our, even our observations about, seemingly objective features of the world are still shaped by our background beliefs and assumptions.
It's a really important point for philosophers to grapple with because a lot of times we think about like empirical observation as being that kind of foundation.
Right, exactly. It's the bedrock.
Yeah. And so if that's already kind of, contaminated, so to speak, by our cultural ideas, then where does that leave us?
Yeah, it definitely throws a wrench in the works. And so the entry also points out that, these impersonal cultural accounts are not just about representations about ideas and theories.
Okay.
They also extend to non-representational phenomena. So, for example, there are debates about, sex-differentiated behavior. Are men and women, are there differences in behavior?
Right.
And to what extent are those differences purely biological? And to what extent are they a result of, cultural expectations and norms about what it means to be a man or a woman?
Right.
So the constructionist argument here is not necessarily that there are no biological differences,
Okay.
but rather that the meaning and significance that we attach to those differences, the behaviors that we associate with them, are deeply influenced by natural factors.
Right, that makes sense. So it's kind of like the raw materials might be there, but how we interpret and use those materials
Exactly.
is very much a cultural product.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the impersonal side, right?
Right.
These kind of large-scale cultural forces that are shaping things.
Right.
But then there's this other category, the personal agents.
Right, yeah. So here the focus shifts to, individual people or particular groups making deliberate choices. And one really fascinating case study that the entry brings in is from Pickering's work constructing quarks,
Okay.
where he looks at the development of scientific theories in physics.
Okay.
And what he finds is that scientists' judgments play a really significant role throughout the process.
I can see that.
So deciding which theories to pursue, evaluating the results of experiments, all of these things involve human choices, human judgments. And so what Pickering is arguing is that the theories that we ultimately end up accepting as true are not simply, dictated by the objective evidence.
Right, they're not just inevitable outcomes of the scientific process.
Exactly. There's a degree of contingency there. There's a degree of human choice and decision-making involved.
Okay.
And hacking, I think, very much supports this idea as well,
Right.
that there's this element of contingency in the development of scientific knowledge.
So it really prompts us as philosophers to think about, like, how much of what we consider scientific knowledge even is shaped by those decisions.
Right.
And were they always, purely objective decisions?
Yeah. And so this leads to a sort of another category, if you were, which the entry calls critical constructionism,
Okay.
which takes this idea of contingency one step further
Okay.
and says, well, let's not just look at the fact that there are choices being made. Let's also look at the reasons behind those choices.
Right.
What are the interests? What are the power dynamics at play that might be influencing, why certain theories are accepted and others are rejected?
Right.
Why certain experiments are done and others are not?
So it's bringing in a kind of social and political dimension
Exactly.
to the analysis.
Right. And a great example here that the entry brings in is Mills's work on, American racial categories,
Okay.
where he shows how the way that we've defined race in America historically has actually served to maintain existing social privileges.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, the so-called one-drop rule, wasn't just a kind of neutral scientific classification.
Right.
It was a way of, maintaining a certain racial hierarchy.
Right. And we see these kinds of historical shifts
Right.
in how we classify humans, whether it's race or gender,
Exactly.
that these are not like fixed natural categories. They really do seem to shift and evolve with power.
Right. And so, we've got these two sort of broad types of agents, right?
Yeah.
The impersonal, these sort of large-scale cultural forces, and then the personal, the intentional actions of individuals and groups.
Yeah.
And they're both contributing to what gets constructed. So the next question is, what is being constructed? What is the why in our equation?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
What are those things that people are pointing to and saying, look, this is socially constructed?
Right, yeah. And the entry sort of identifies three main categories:
Okay.
representations, facts, and human traits and kinds.
Okay.
So let's start with the first one, representations.
Oh, yeah.
These are our ideas, our theories, concepts, accounts, the taxonomies that we use to, classify the world. And this is perhaps the most intuitive area, I think, for thinking about social influence.
Right. Because it seems like language is definitely like socially, transmitted and evolves over time.
Exactly. Yeah. And, as the entry points out, a lot of the debate about social construction, especially in, what was called the science wars,
Right.
focused on precisely this question: the extent to which social factors influence the development of scientific theories.
Okay. Yeah.
And the philosophical question here is, are we just constructing stories about the world?
Right.
Or are we actually uncovering objective truths?
Right. Are we describing reality or are we creating reality through our descriptions?
Exactly. And the entry acknowledges that there are many different perspectives within the philosophy of science. People who defend scientific realism, people who are more skeptical of scientific realism. And it's a complex issue. It's a complex debate.
Yeah.
But this is certainly one of the central areas where social construction has been you know, very influential in terms of generating philosophical discussion.
Right. And it seems like, even outside of the hard sciences, right?
Right.
Just
Yeah.
how we classify things, in our everyday lives, those classifications seem to come from our culture.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's representations. But social constructionists don't just stop at representations. They also talk about the social construction of facts.
Oh, okay, this is where it gets tricky.
Right. And this is where I think things get a little bit more metaphysically challenging.
Right.
The idea that even facts themselves, not just our representations of facts,
Right.
could be socially constructed.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right. And then finally, we have the social construction of human traits and kinds.
Oh, okay. So, this is where the debate about human nature really comes in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Are we, products of nature, or are we products of nurture?
Right. Our emotions, for example, innate,
Right.
are they universal? Or are they shaped by our cultural backgrounds? Are there, human kinds, like, racial categories, gender categories? Are those categories natural kinds?
Right.
Are they grounded in biology? Or are they social constructions?
Right. And this is where it seems like even within, social constructionist thought, there are different positions.
Right.
Because, for example, in philosophy of race, the dominant view seems to be that race is real as a social construct.
Right.
It's not saying that there are no racial differences, but that those differences are socially produced.
Right, exactly. So, it's not just that there's no biological basis for race, it's that the very category of race is a product of, social and historical processes.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay, so we've looked at these different kinds of things that social constructionists claim are constructed.
Right.
Representations, facts, human traits, and kinds. Now, I think a really important distinction that the entry brings in is between what's called global constructionism and local constructionism.
Okay.
So global constructionism is the view that all facts are socially constructed.
So that's a very strong claim.
Very strong claim, yeah, that there's no such thing as an objective fact independent of our social and cultural practices.
Right.
Local constructionism, on the other hand, is a bit more modest. It says that only particular facts or phenomena are socially constructed.
Okay, so being a U.S. senator is a social construction.
Exactly, yeah.
Because that's a role that is defined by our institutions.
Right, or, the fact that this piece of paper counts as money.
Right.
That's clearly a result of social agreement. But the local constructionists might say, well, there are other facts that are not socially constructed. Maybe, the fact that water is H2O.
Right.
Or that the Earth revolves around the sun.
Right. Okay, so that seems to be a little bit more manageable philosophically.
Right. And in fact, global constructionism faces some pretty serious philosophical challenges. The most famous one being the sort of self-referential problem.
Right, because if everything is constructed, then is the claim that everything is constructed also constructed?
Exactly, yeah. So it seems to kind of undermine itself. So, local constructionism, I think, is the more common, the more familiar view, in contemporary philosophy. And within local constructionism, there's another distinction that the entry brings in, which is between what's called overt construction and covert construction.
Okay.
So, the U.S. Senator example, that's an overt construction. We all know that that's a role that's created by our institutions.
Right.
But there are also cases where social construction might be covert, where we don't even realize that something is socially constructed. And a lot of the work of social construction is precisely to uncover those covert constructions.
Okay.
To show how things that we take for granted as being natural or inevitable are actually a result of, social practices and norms that we're often not even aware of.
Yeah.
And, the entry gives a bunch of examples of this from the philosophy of psychiatry, the study of emotions, race and gender. All of these areas have been subject to constructionist scrutiny.
Right.
To show how things that we might think of as being purely biological or, given by nature are actually shaped by social forces.
Right. And I guess the idea here is that if we can show that these categories, these concepts are actually socially constructed, then that gives us some degree of freedom to potentially change them.
Exactly. Yeah. It kind of undermines the idea that these things are fixed and inevitable, and it opens up the possibility for, social change.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about the X, who or what constructs. We talked about the Y, what gets constructed.
Right.
So now we need to talk about, the relationship between the two.
Right.
Wait, what does it actually mean to construct something?
Right. What is it to construct?
Yeah, and I think it's important to distinguish here between, like, the everyday use of the term construction
Hmm.
and what philosophers have in mind.
Right, yeah. So the entry distinguishes between two main types of construction: causal construction and constitutive construction.
Okay.
So causal construction is the less metaphysically problematic one, I think.
Okay.
This is the idea that X causes Y to exist, or X causes Y to persist, or X exerts significant control over Y's typical properties.
Okay.
So, a simple example, if I build a house,
Right.
I've causally constructed the house.
Right. I caused it to exist.
Exactly. I brought it into being. And naturalists, by and large, are pretty comfortable with this notion of causal construction because it fits in with, their general focus on causal explanations.
Right. Okay, so that's one type.
Right.
And then there's the more philosophical one.
Right. Constitutive construction.
Right.
So here, the idea is that X's conceptual or social activity is metaphysically necessary for Y to be a Y.
Okay.
So it's not just that X causes Y to exist. It's that without X, Y couldn't even exist as the kind of thing that it is.
Okay, I think I get it, but can you give me an example?
Sure. Yeah. So a classic example here is a watch.
Okay.
Right. So, certain representations of a watch, the concept of a watch, those are causally necessary for somebody to intentionally create a watch.
Right.
But it seems, at least metaphysically, possible that, something with all the physical features of a watch could exist without ever having been conceived of as a watch.
Okay, so like if a bunch of rocks happen to fall together in just the right way.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's causal necessity.
Right.
But constitutive necessity is stronger than that. It's saying that, for certain kinds of things, our conceptual activity, our social practices, are actually partly constitutive of what those things are.
Okay.
So, for example, Searle argues that certain kinds of social facts, like, a cocktail party or a war,
Okay.
part of what makes something a cocktail party is precisely that we recognize it as such, that we treat it as such.
Okay, so our collective agreement that it's a cocktail party
Right.
is part of what makes it a cocktail party.
Exactly. Yeah. And this kind of gets at the some of the more provocative claims, I think, made by social constructionists. For example, the idea that, certain categories like homosexual or race are modern inventions,
Okay.
that they didn't exist before a certain point in time. And that's not just to say that our understanding of them has changed.
Right.
It's to say that the categories themselves were brought into being through social and conceptual practices.
Right. So it's like we're drawing the lines in a different place now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that creates a new category.
Right. And so, one way of thinking about this constitutive necessity is to say, well, it's just analytic.
Okay.
It's true by definition.
Okay.
But the entry points out that, this is not so easy to maintain given, Quine's work on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
Right.
And in any case, it seems particularly implausible for covertly constructed kinds.
Right.
Because it's not like we, consciously decide that certain mental illnesses exist.
Right. Exactly.
So if it's not analytic necessity, then what is it?
Right. Right.
And the entry suggests that one way of thinking about this is in terms of a posteriori necessity.
Okay.
So this is the idea, made famous by Kripke and Putnam, that certain truths are necessary, but we only discover them through empirical investigation.
Right. Like water is H2O.
Exactly. Yeah. We didn't know that water was H2O, a priori. We had to discover it through, chemical analysis.
Right.
But once we discovered it, we realized that that's a necessary truth.
Right.
Water couldn't be anything other than H2O. And so the constructionist might say, well, something similar is going on with these socially constructed kinds.
Okay.
That, even though we might have initially thought that race was a purely biological category, in fact, the term race, refers to something that's socially produced.
Right.
Because our use of the term, the way that we apply it, is intimately connected to, social practices that create and maintain racial differences.
Okay, so even if our folk theory of what race is wrong,
Right.
the term itself can still successfully latch on to this socially produced kind.
Exactly, yeah. So the term, even though we might be mistaken about the nature of the thing that it refers to, it still manages to refer.
Right, I see. Okay, so that seems to be a pretty powerful way to respond to, the skeptic who says, well, if race isn't biological, then it's not real. the constructionist can say, no, it's real. It's just real in a different way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
real as a social construct. But the entry also points out that there are some challenges with applying this causal theory of reference, straightforwardly to the case of social construction.
Okay.
In particular, we need to be able to characterize these social objects in a way that doesn't presuppose the very concepts that we're claiming are constructed.
Right.
So how do we talk about, race as a social construct without, already assuming that we know what race is?
Right. Right. It's like if you're trying to explain what a chair is, you can't use the word chair in the definition.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one challenge. And the entry also briefly mentions neo-Kantian interpretations of constitutive construction,
Okay.
where the idea is that our sociolinguistic activity, kind of provides a framework for structuring our experience and knowledge of the world. But, this raises a whole other set of philosophical issues, particularly about, how to reconcile this view with naturalism.
Right. Right.
Those are some of the ways of thinking about, constitutive construction. Now, obviously one of the big questions here is how does all of this relate to naturalism?
Yes.
The view that science is our best guide to understanding the world.
Right.
And as the entry points out, naturalism itself is a pretty broad church. There are lots of different ways of being a naturalist.
Right.
But one thing that naturalists tend to share is a commitment to realism, the idea that there's a world out there independent of our minds.
Right.
And that our beliefs and theories are supposed to be about that world.
Right.
And they also tend to emphasize the importance of empirical evidence, observation, experimentation, those sorts of things.
Right. Yeah.
So given that background, how does social construction fit in? And the entry points out that there are, various ways of trying to reconcile these two views.
Okay.
So for example, one strategy is to focus on the causal aspects of social construction.
Okay. Yeah, because naturalists love causal explanations.
Exactly. Yeah, and the entry points out that a lot of naturalistic work in areas that social constructionists are also interested in, things like gender, race, emotions, those sorts of things, involves trying to develop causal models of those phenomena.
Okay, so like looking at how social factors like, upbringing or social roles, cause certain differences in behavior or traits.
Exactly, yeah, and that's perfectly compatible with naturalism.
Right.
Where things get a bit trickier for naturalists is with the constitutive claims of social construction.
Okay, right.
Because, if something is constitutively constructed, then it seems like it's not really independent of our minds in the way that naturalists typically think that, objects in the world are.
Right.
And so, there's a lot of debate about how to make sense of that.
Right.
One strategy, I think, is to focus on the social construction of representations.
Okay.
So the entry points out that a lot of the sort of seemingly radical claims of social constructionists, when you actually look at them carefully, they're really just claims about how certain representations come to be accepted.
Right.
So, for example, Pickering's work on quirks or Lacour's work on sex, the naturalist might say, well, what they're really showing is just how certain theories came to be accepted within a certain community.
Right.
They're not saying that quarks are socially constructed or that sex is socially constructed. They're just saying that our theories about quarks or our theories about sex are socially constructed.
Right. It's like the map is socially constructed, but the territory itself
Exactly.
is still out there.
And that's a much more palatable claim for the naturalists.
Right. That makes sense.
And the entry points out that, one way of making sense of this is to think about, cases from the history of science.
Okay.
So, the Ptolemaic, geocentric theory of the universe
Right.
was a social construction in the sense that, it was a theory that was developed and accepted by a particular community at a particular time.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the universe was actually geocentric.
Right.
So, we can grant that there are these social influences on how we represent the world without having to give up on the idea that there's an objective world out there that we're trying to represent.
Right. And that seems to be like a key challenge for naturalistic approaches to social construction, right?
Right.
Is how to reconcile, this apparent social influence on the development of our beliefs
Right.
with the idea that science is still giving us, objective knowledge about the world.
Exactly. Yeah. So, one way that naturalists have tried to do this is by emphasizing the importance of, realism and empiricism.
Okay.
That there's a real world out there independent of our minds,
Right.
and that science is our best method for coming to know that world.
Right.
And one specific example of this that the entry discusses is Fodor's theory of the modularity of perception.
Okay.
So the idea here is that, some of our basic perceptual processes are actually kind of encapsulated.
Okay.
They operate independently of our higher level beliefs and theories.
So what we perceive isn't totally like infected by our biases.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, we might have all sorts of crazy beliefs about the world,
Right.
but when it comes to, basic perception, seeing a tree in front of us,
Right.
that's not really affected by those beliefs.
Open
And that's
up.
a good thing for the naturalist, right? Because it means that there's at least some part of our cognitive system that's giving us reliable information about the world.
Right. It's kind of like a bedrock foundation for knowledge.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, as the entry points out, Fodor's view is not without its critics.
Right.
And there's a lot of debate about, how to square his view with the insights of social constructionism.
Right.
But I think it's an interesting example of, how naturalists are trying to grapple with this issue.
Right.
And then beyond the social construction of representations of the external world, naturalists have also thought about the social construction of representations as internal human traits.
Okay.
So our beliefs and concepts themselves.
Yeah.
And here I think naturalists have actually been a bit more sympathetic to constructionist ideas.
Okay, so like how our culture shapes our beliefs about, morality or politics, those kinds of things.
Exactly, yeah. And, the entry mentions some of